My daughter gave me conditions for attending her wedding because of her stepfather. So I am Marion, 58 years old, former owner of a construction company I built from the ground up. When my daughter Amanda sent me her wedding invitation, I was thrilled until I saw the list of rules attached. Rules about how I should behave, what I could say, and how I should interact with guests. All because of her stepfather. My relationship with Amanda has been complicated since her mother remarried. What happened next changed everything between us. I was heartbroken but determined. Before I tell you how this all unfolded, let me know where you are watching from. Give this video a thumbs up if you believe family relationships should be built on mutual respect, and subscribe to join me for more life stories. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, where I learned the value of hard work from an early age. My father was a carpenter, who taught me everything he knew about building things that last. By 20, I was working construction jobs, saving every penny. By 25, I had started my own small construction company. At 26, I married Sophia, my high school sweetheart. We had dated on and off since our junior year. She was beautiful, smart, and ambitious. We both wanted the same things: a stable home, financial security, and a family. A year later, our daughter Amanda was born, and I felt my life was complete. I still remember holding Amanda for the first time in the hospital. She was so tiny, with a full head of dark hair and these bright blue eyes that seemed to look right into my soul. I promised her right then that I would always protect her and give her the best life possible. Those early years were challenging, but wonderful. I worked 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks to grow my business while providing for my family. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a good school district. Nothing fancy, but it was ours, and I was proud of what we had accomplished. When Amanda was little, we had this special Saturday morning routine. Sophia would sleep in, and Amanda and I would make pancakes. She would stand on a chair at the counter, tongue poking out in concentration, as she helped mix the batter. Those simple moments meant everything to me. As she grew, I taught her how to fish at the local creek, ride a bike without training wheels, and build a birdhouse in my workshop. I never missed a school play or a parent-teacher conference. Even when I was exhausted from work, I made time for bedtime stories every night. When Amanda was about 8, I started noticing changes in my marriage. Sophia seemed increasingly distant and restless. She had taken a job at a local real estate office and was making new friends, people with bigger houses and fancier cars than what we had. "I feel like we are stuck in a rut, Marion," she told me one night after Amanda was asleep. "Everyone around us is moving forward, and we are just here." I tried explaining that building something lasting takes time, that I was reinvesting in the business so we could have a more secure future. But Sophia wanted the future now. She started complaining about our house, our car, even the vacations we took to the Oregon coast instead of Hawaii or Europe. I worked harder, took on more projects, hired more people. The business grew, and we were actually doing well financially. I surprised Sophia with a new car for her birthday when Amanda was 12. We renovated our kitchen the following year. But nothing seemed to make Sophia happy anymore. When Amanda turned 14, Sophia asked for a divorce. "I love you, Marion," she said, "but I am not in love with you anymore. We want different things from life." I was blindsided. I begged her to try counseling to give our marriage another chance for Amanda's sake. But her mind was made up. The divorce was civilized on paper. We agreed to split everything 50-50, including time with Amanda. She would spend 1 week with me, 1 week with her mother, who moved into a condo downtown. Those first few months were agonizing, but manageable. Amanda seemed to adjust. Okay, though I could tell she was hurting. We talked openly about her feelings, and I made sure she knew that both her parents still loved her completely, even if we could not be together anymore. "Dad," She asked me one night as I tucked her in. Will you ever get married again? I do not know, sweetheart. I answered honestly. Right now I am focused on you and making sure you are happy. She hugged me extra tight that night. I am glad you are my dad, she whispered. Those words carried me through many dark moments in the months that followed. Little did I know how quickly everything would change. Just 6 months after our divorce was finalized, Sophia met Richard. He was a real estate developer who had recently moved to our area from Chicago. Tall, polished, with expensive suits and a luxury car, Richard was everything I was not. Where I was plain-spoken and practical, he was smooth and flashy. Where I had calloused hands from physical work, he had manicured nails and designer watches. The first time I met him was when I picked up Amanda from Sophia's condo. He was there making dinner in my former wife's kitchen. The way he looked at me with that barely concealed smirk made my blood boil. But I kept my composure for Amanda's sake. Nice to meet you, Marion, he said, extending his hand. I have heard so much about you. I doubted that very much, but I shook his hand firmly. Likewise. Richard wasted no time inserting himself into Amanda's life. The next week, when it was Sophia's turn with Amanda, he took them both to a concert Amanda had been dying to see. The week after that, it was shopping at the fancy mall in Portland. Soon he was attending her school events, sitting right beside Sophia, while I sat a few rows back alone. When Amanda came home with a brand new phone, I asked her about it. Richard gave it to me, she said casually, as if it were nothing. He said my old one was outdated. The phone I had given her just 6 months earlier for her birthday. That was very generous of him, I managed to say, swallowing my pride. Then came the ski trip to Aspen during Christmas break and the spring break getaway to Florida. Places I could never afford to take her, not with the mortgage and the business loans and the child support payments. I noticed Amanda becoming increasingly excited about her weeks with Sophia and Richard. She would come back talking nonstop about the restaurants they visited, the people they met, the plans they were making for summer. Her enthusiasm for our activities together began to dim by comparison. Our fishing trips seemed boring. Our movie nights at home with pizza seemed pathetic next to dining out at upscale restaurants. Dad, she said to me one night, not even looking up from her new phone. Richard's house is just more fun. They have a pool and a home theater room, and his friends have kids my age who go to private school. Each word was a dagger, but I nodded and smiled. I am glad you are enjoying yourself, sweetheart. What could I say? That I was working overtime to keep up with the lifestyle Richard was casually providing, that I had canceled my one fishing trip with my buddies that year, so I could put that money toward the science camp she wanted to attend, that I lay awake at night, worrying. I was losing her when Amanda was 16. Richard and Sophia got married in a lavish ceremony at a vineyard outside town. Amanda was a junior bridesmaid, beaming in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I was not invited to the wedding, of course, but I saw the photos Amanda showed me afterward. Richard is taking us to Italy for their honeymoon, and I get to go too, she exclaimed. We will be gone for 2 weeks. Is that okay, Dad? It would mean she would miss her week with me, but how could I say no and be the bad guy? Of course, sweetheart. Take lots of pictures for me. After they returned from Italy, Amanda asked if she could switch to spending weekends with me instead of full weeks. Richard's house is closer to school and all my activities, she explained. I agreed, telling myself that quality mattered more than quantity. But even our weekends together grew shorter. She would come late on Saturday mornings because of sleepovers at friends' houses. She would leave early Sunday afternoons for study groups or shopping trips with Sophia. Our time dwindled to brief snippets of conversation between her texting with friends. By the time Amanda graduated high school, I felt like a spectator in her life rather than a participant. At the ceremony, I sat in the general audience while Richard and Sophia had reserved seats near the front. At the party afterward, hosted at Richard and Sophia's new 5-bedroom house with a view of the mountains, I felt like just another guest, not the father of the graduate. "You have raised an amazing young woman," one of Sophia's friends said to me, champagne flute in hand. "We all did our part," I replied, watching as Amanda posed for photos with Richard's arm around her shoulder. Amanda chose to attend Westridge University, a prestigious private college on the East Coast. Richard proudly announced at her graduation party that he would be covering her tuition and expenses. I pulled Sophia aside later that evening. "I have been saving for Amanda's college since she was born," I told her. "I want to contribute." Sophia looked uncomfortable. "Richard wants to do this for her, Marion. You know how he is when he sets his mind to something." "She is my daughter too," I insisted. "At least let me pay for her books and spending money." We reached a compromise. I would send Amanda a monthly allowance directly. It was far less than I had saved for, but it allowed me to feel I was still supporting my child through college. During her freshman year, Amanda called once a week, usually on Sundays. By sophomore year, those calls had dwindled to twice a month, then once. Our conversations became increasingly superficial. "How are classes going?" I would ask. "Fine, busy with midterms, or finals, or projects. Always busy." "Are you enjoying your economics major?" "Yeah, it is interesting. Richard says it is a good foundation for business school later," Richard said. "Richard thinks," Richard suggested. His name peppered our conversations, while details about her actual life remained vague and elusive. When she was a junior, I decided to surprise her with a visit. I had sold my construction company the year before to a larger firm, keeping a small stake, but stepping away from day-to-day operations. At 53, I was semi-retired, living in a comfortable but modest condo. I had time now, if not the same resources as before. I called Amanda to let her know I was coming, expecting enthusiasm. Instead, there was a long pause. "This weekend is not great, Dad. I have so much studying to do, and there is this networking event that Richard arranged with some of his college friends who work on Wall Street now." "I could come to the networking event with you," I offered. "I might not know Wall Street, but I know plenty about business." Another pause. Maybe next time would be better. I ended up postponing the trip. Next time never seemed to come. That Thanksgiving, Amanda came home and I was invited to dinner at Richard and Sophia's house. Their new house was even larger than the previous one, with soaring ceilings and enormous windows showcasing mountain views. Everything was professionally decorated in neutral tones that made me afraid to sit on the furniture. Richard dominated the conversation, talking about his latest development project and the celebrities who had purchased units in his buildings. When I tried to share news about some of my former employees who had started their own successful contracting business, Sophia quickly changed the subject. "Amanda, tell your father about your internship," she said. Amanda brightened. "I will be interning at Richard's company next summer, in the finance department. Richard says it will be perfect experience for my resume." "That sounds wonderful," I said, trying to mask my disappointment. She had not even mentioned applying for this internship to me. "I thought you might want to come home for the summer. I have missed having you around." "Dad, this is a huge opportunity," Amanda said, exchanging glances with Sophia and Richard. "Besides, Richard and Mom are letting me stay in their Manhattan apartment. It would be crazy to turn that down to come back here." Here, where I was, where she grew up. Now just a provincial backwater compared to the glittering life Richard offered. After dinner, Richard brought out an expensive bottle of scotch and 2 crystal glasses. He did not offer me any or bring a third glass. The message was clear: I did not belong in their inner circle. I left early, claiming I had an early morning appointment. No one tried very hard to convince me to stay. As the years passed, I found myself learning about Amanda's life more through social media than from her directly. She posted pictures from gallery openings in New York, charity galas, vacations in the Hamptons. Richard and Sophia featured prominently in these photos. I appeared in none of them. When I turned 55, Amanda forgot my birthday entirely. She called 3 days later, full of apologies. "I am so sorry, Dad. We were on this amazing yacht trip with Richard's business partners and I lost track of the dates." Her profile had been active that day, posting pictures from the yacht. Multiple pictures. She had not lost track of anything, except perhaps my importance in her life. A month later, I had a health scare. Chest pains that turned out to be stress-related rather than a heart attack. I was in the hospital overnight for observation. I called Amanda to let her know I was okay, not wanting to worry her. "Oh my God, Dad, that is scary," she said. "Do you need anything? Should I come home?" No, I am fine," I assured her. "The doctor says I just need to relax more, maybe take up meditation or something." "Good idea. Listen, I have to run. I am late for drinks with James. But take care of yourself, okay? Love you." James, I would learn later, was Amanda's new boyfriend. I would not meet him for another 6 months, at another carefully choreographed dinner at Richard and Sophia's house. He was handsome, well-dressed, and worked at a prestigious consulting firm. He had gone to the same prep school as Richard's nephew. Of course, James was polite to me, asking questions about my construction background, with what seemed like genuine interest. But I could see the way he deferred to Richard, laughing a little too hard at his jokes, agreeing enthusiastically with his political opinions. Another person in Amanda's life who understood where the real power lay. As I drove home that night, I wondered if this was how it would always be. Me on the periphery, watching my daughter's life from a distance, included as an afterthought, a obligation, a courtesy. Little did I know that things were about to come to a head in a way I never expected. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday in April. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper with gold embossing. Expensive, like everything in Amanda's life now. My hands actually trembled a bit as I opened it. My little girl was getting married. Despite everything, I felt a surge of joy and pride. The invitation itself was beautiful. Amanda Elizabeth Bennett and James William Harrington requested the honor of my presence at their wedding in September at some vineyard estate I had never heard of. I traced my finger over Amanda's name, remembering how I had practiced writing it out over and over when Sophia and I were discussing baby names all those years ago. There was a smaller envelope inside with just my name written on it. I opened it, expecting perhaps a personal note from Amanda. Instead, what I found was a typed list titled "Considerations for the Wedding." As I read through the list, my heart sank lower and lower. These weren't considerations. They were conditions, rules for my behavior if I wanted to attend my own daughter's wedding. 1. Please refrain from mentioning being the one who paid for Amanda's first car or college application fees, as this conflicts with the family narrative and might confuse guests. 2. Avoid bringing up childhood memories that might give guests the wrong impression about Amanda's family structure growing up. 3. Limit extended conversations with Sophia's family members to avoid any awkwardness. 4. Understand that as Richard has been a significant father figure in Amanda's adult life, he will be giving the main father speech at the reception. You are welcome to say a few words if time allows. 5. Richard will be walking Amanda down the aisle as he has been instrumental in shaping her career path and future. You will have the opportunity for one father-daughter dance at the reception. 6. Please bring a respectable date or attend alone. This is a sophisticated event with many of Richard's business associates present. 7. While we appreciate any contribution you wish to make toward wedding expenses, please understand that Richard is handling the bulk of the costs as his gift to Amanda. I had to read the list twice to fully comprehend what was being asked of me. I was being told not to talk about my role in my daughter's life, not to mention the sacrifices I had made, the love I had given the father I had been for her first 14 years. I was being asked to step aside and let Richard take credit for raising my child. My hands were shaking, but this time from anger rather than emotion. I called my brother Frank immediately. "Can you believe this?" I asked after reading him the list. "I'm being treated like some distant relative who might embarrass the family, not like her father." Frank's voice was tight with controlled anger on my behalf. "This is Richard's doing. Has to be. The Amanda I know wouldn't treat you this way." But that was just it. I wasn't sure I knew Amanda anymore. The little girl who had made pancakes with me on Saturday mornings seemed very far away from the woman who could send me this list of conditions. "What are you going to do?" Frank asked. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I need some time to think." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I had put Amanda first, working overtime to pay for her braces, driving 4 hours round trip twice a week for a year so she could take special art classes that weren't available in our town, selling my beloved vintage motorcycle to help pay for her first car, staying in our small town rather than expanding my business to Portland, because I didn't want to disrupt her school and friendships. I thought about her high school graduation, where I had sat in the back while Richard and Sophia had front row seats. I thought about the college parents' weekend I'd attended alone, where Amanda had introduced me to her friends as my dad, but had shown off Richard to her professors as someone with connections. I thought about how little by little I had allowed myself to be sidelined in my own daughter's life. How I had told myself it was for her benefit, that I didn't want to make waves, that I just wanted her to be happy. But this list of conditions crossed a line I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth, about respect, about what kind of relationship we would have going forward. As the dawn light filtered through my bedroom window, I knew what I had to do. The morning after receiving Amanda's wedding invitation, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The sleepless night had given way to a profound realization. I had spent too long accepting scraps of my daughter's attention, too long allowing myself to be diminished in her eyes. I took the day off and drove to the storage unit where I kept boxes of family mementos that didn't fit in my condo. There I found the photo albums chronicling Amanda's childhood, pictures of me teaching her to swim, building her treehouse, bandaging her scraped knees. Cards she had made me for Father's Day with misspelled words and backward letters that I had found more precious than any expensive gift. I found the financial records too. Receipts for her braces, her summer camps, her first car, documentation of the college fund. I had started the day she was born and faithfully contributed to every month until the divorce. Proof of the child support payments I had never missed, even when business was slow and I had to take out a loan to make ends meet. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were evidence of a life spent prioritizing my daughter's well-being and happiness. They were reminders that despite what Richard might have told her, I had been a good father. I had been there. I had loved her unconditionally. That afternoon, I called my oldest friend Thomas for coffee. We had known each other since high school, and he had watched Amanda grow up. He had also seen me struggle through the divorce and the gradual estrangement that followed. "I need your honest opinion," I told him after explaining the situation. "Am I overreacting to this list? Is it reasonable for me to feel this insulted?" Thomas took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture he made when he was choosing his words carefully. "Marian, if my son sent me something like this, I'd be heartbroken. But more than that, I'd be worried about what kind of person he was becoming if he thought this was an acceptable way to treat his father." His words crystallized something for me. This wasn't just about my feelings being hurt. It was about the values I had tried to instill in Amanda. Honesty, respect, gratitude. Somewhere along the way, surrounded by Richard's wealth and influence, she had lost sight of these. "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked, echoing Frank's question from the night before. This time, I had an answer. "I'm going to tell her the truth, and then I'm going to respect myself enough to set some boundaries." That evening, I sat down at my desk and began to write Amanda a letter. Not an angry letter, though I certainly felt anger. Not a self-pitying letter, though the hurt was real and deep. Instead, I wrote from my heart with love and honesty, and yes, a newfound sense of my own worth. "Dear Amanda," I began, "I received your wedding invitation, and I want you to know that my first reaction was joy. Joy that you have found someone to share your life with, joy that you are celebrating this milestone, joy simply because you are my daughter, and I love you without condition or reservation." But then I read the list of considerations, and my joy gave way to something else. Not anger, though I felt that too. What I felt most strongly was sadness. Sadness that our relationship has reached a point where you feel it necessary to police my behavior and limit my role in what should be one of the happiest days of both our lives. I have spent years accepting a diminishing place in your life. I told myself it was what you needed, that it wasn't a competition between me and Richard, that your happiness was all that mattered. And your happiness does matter to me, Amanda. It always has. But so does the truth. The truth is that I have been your father every day of your life, even the days when you didn't see me or call me or think of me. I was the one who held you when you had nightmares, who taught you to ride a bike, who drove you to your first day of kindergarten, and cried all the way home because I was so proud and terrified all at once. I was the one who worked 60-hour weeks to provide for you, who saved for your college education since the day you were born, who never missed a child support payment even when times were tough. Not because it was my legal obligation, but because it was my privilege to contribute to your well-being. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty or to compete with Richard. He has given you things I never could, and if you love and respect him, then I am glad for that relationship in your life. But I cannot and will not pretend to be less than I am. I cannot agree to be a footnote at your wedding or to erase the history we share. I cannot smile and nod while Richard takes credit for raising you, when I know the countless hours, the sleepless nights, the endless worry and boundless love that I have invested in you from the moment you existed. So while it breaks my heart to say this, I will not be attending your wedding under the conditions you have set. My love for you is unconditional, but my presence at your wedding cannot be conditional on me denying the most important role I have ever held, being your father. I will always be here for you. My door will always be open. But I need you to understand that a relationship, even between parent and child, must be built on mutual respect and honesty. I have always respected you, Amanda. I am simply asking for the same in return. With all my love, always, Dad. I included with the letter a small album of photographs documenting our life together, copies of some of the financial records showing my contributions to her upbringing, and a few of the Father's Day cards she had made me as a child. I also sent a separate package containing my wedding gift to her, a delicate silver locket I had found at an antique shop. Inside, I placed a tiny photo of Amanda as a baby sleeping in my arms. On the back, I had engraved the words, "Forever my daughter, forever loved." The next morning, I mailed both packages with a mixture of sadness and surprisingly relief. For the first time in years, I had spoken my truth without apologizing for it. I had drawn a boundary based not on resentment, but on self-respect. Whatever happened next would be painful, I knew that much. But I also knew I could face it with dignity. 3 weeks passed without a word from Amanda. I checked my phone obsessively the first few days, jumping at every notification. But eventually, I had to accept that she wasn't going to respond right away, if at all. During this time, I focused on rebuilding my life outside of my identity as Amanda's father. I had let many friendships lapse over the years, prioritizing work, and then later isolating myself as depression took hold after the divorce and Amanda's gradual withdrawal. On Thomas's recommendation, I joined a support group for estranged parents. Sitting in a circle with others who understood the particular pain of being separated from their children brought both comfort and perspective. Some had situations far worse than mine. Some had not spoken to their children in decades. Their stories helped me prepare for the possibility that Amanda might choose to cut me out of her life entirely. "The hardest lesson," said a woman named Dorothy, whose son hadn't spoken to her in 15 years, "is learning that you can't control other people's choices. You can only control how you respond to them." I took her words to heart and began focusing on the things I could control. I started swimming 3 times a week at the local rec center. I volunteered at a program teaching construction skills to at-risk youth. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones. One of those reconnections was with Sandra, a woman I had known casually through community events over the years. Recently divorced herself, she had a warmth and straightforward manner that I found refreshing. We started meeting for coffee, then dinner, then weekend hiking trips. For the first time since Sophia left, I found myself looking forward to sharing my day with someone. "You're different than you used to be," Sandra told me one evening as we walked along the riverfront. "More present somehow. Losing a child teaches you not to take anything for granted," I replied, then corrected myself. "Not that I've lost Amanda exactly, but having to redefine our relationship has changed me." Sandra squeezed my hand. "Sometimes the hardest changes bring unexpected gifts." She was right. As painful as the situation with Amanda was, it had forced me to reckon with patterns I had fallen into. Always putting others first. Accepting disrespect to keep the peace. Defining my worth through other people's perceptions. In standing up for myself with Amanda, I had begun to stand up for myself in all areas of my life. Just as I was finding a new equilibrium, my phone rang one evening with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a male voice said, "Mr. Bennett, this is James Harrington, Amanda's fiancé. I was hoping we could meet to talk." My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course, James. When and where would you like to meet?" We arranged to meet the following day at a cafe halfway between our locations. I arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table. When James walked in, he looked different than I remembered from our brief meeting at Richard and Sophia's. More serious, less polished somehow. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he sat down. "I wanted to talk to you without Amanda knowing." "Is she all right?" I asked immediately, parental concern overriding everything else. "Physically, yes. Emotionally, I'm not so sure." James fiddled with his coffee cup. "I found your letter. Amanda received it 3 weeks ago, read it, and then put it away without saying anything. She's been different since then. Quiet, distant. She says everything's fine, but I can tell it's not. I'm sorry to hear that, I said sincerely. It wasn't my intention to upset her. No, I don't think you should be sorry, James said, surprising me. I read the letter too, and the conditions that were sent to you. I had no idea Amanda had done that. Or rather, that Richard had done that. Richard? I leaned forward. What do you mean? James sighed deeply. Amanda admitted that most of the considerations came from Richard. He drafted them, and she went along with it. She was too embarrassed to tell me the full story, but I've pieced it together over time. A mixture of emotions washed over me. Relief that Amanda hadn't entirely conceived of those hurtful conditions herself. Anger at Richard's continued manipulation. Concern that my daughter was still so easily influenced by him. There's more, James continued. The things you wrote about in your letter about your role in Amanda's childhood. She's never really talked about that part of her life with me. When I ask about her childhood, she always starts the stories from when her mom married Richard. It's like there's this whole chapter of her life that's been, I don't know, redacted somehow. What would you like to know? I asked carefully. Everything, James said simply. I'm marrying Amanda in 2 months, and I feel like I only know half of who she is. So I told him. Not in a bitter way, not to score points against Richard or Sophia, but honestly. I told him about Amanda's early years, her spirit and curiosity, her stubbornness and compassion. I told him about teaching her to fish, about our Saturday morning pancakes, about the time she organized a neighborhood cleanup at age 9 because she was worried about the ducks at the local pond eating litter. James listened intently, occasionally asking questions. When I finished, he sat back with a troubled expression. Richard has been rewriting the narrative for years, he said. He talks about Amanda like she's one of his development projects, something he built from the ground up. And she lets him, even though it erases you and her early years. Why are you telling me this? I asked. James met my eyes directly. Because I love Amanda, and I want her to be whole. She can't be whole while denying part of her history, part of herself. He paused. And because the man I just heard about, the father you were to her, that's the kind of father I hope to be someday. I don't want to be like Richard, treating my children as extensions of my ego. His words touched me deeply. For years, I had felt as though I was shouting into a void, my role in Amanda's life, unacknowledged and unvalued. Now here was her future husband, validating what I had known all along. What happens now? I asked. I'm going to talk to Amanda, James said firmly. Not to force her to reconcile with you if she's not ready, but to encourage her to be honest with herself about her past, about who she is and where she came from. That's all I can ask for, I said. Just know that my door is always open to her. As we stood to leave, James hesitated, then said, Mr. Bennett, Marion, whatever happens with the wedding, whether you attend or not, I want you to know that I see you. I see what you did for Amanda, what you gave up for her, and I respect it immensely. I extended my hand, and he shook it firmly. Take care of her, James. That's all I've ever wanted, for someone to love her as completely as I do. I will, he promised, and I hope you'll be a part of our lives going forward. The real you, not the watered-down version Richard wants to present. As I watched him walk away, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Not certainty, not expectation, but simple, cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, the door to reconciliation wasn't completely closed. 1 week before the wedding, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Sandra was out of town visiting her sister. When I opened the door, Amanda stood there looking so much like the little girl I remembered, and yet so different. Professional, polished, clearly expensive clothes, but with eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then simultaneously, we both said, "I'm sorry." It broke the tension, and I stepped back, inviting her in. My condo was modest but comfortable. Nothing like Richard and Sophia's showplace, but it was mine, paid for with the proceeds from selling my business. A home, not a statement. Amanda sat stiffly on the couch, clutching her purse like a shield. I offered her tea, which she accepted, and used the few minutes in the kitchen to collect myself. When I returned with 2 mugs, she had removed her jacket and looked marginally more relaxed. "James spoke with you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I confirmed. "He loves you very much." Amanda nodded, staring into her tea. "He was upset about the letter. The conditions. He said," and her voice faltered, "he said I was becoming someone he didn't recognize. People who love us can sometimes see things in us that we can't see ourselves," I said gently. She looked up, then tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't write those conditions, Dad. Well, not most of them. Richard did. He said it would be easier for everyone if expectations were clear from the start. I went along with it because—" She trailed off, seeming unable to find the words. "Because it was easier than standing up to him," I finished for her. "Yes," she whispered. "It's always been easier to go along with what Richard wants. He can be so generous when you're on his side and so difficult when you're not." "I understand that," I said, thinking of all the times I had watched Richard manipulate situations to his advantage, using his wealth and connections as both carrot and stick. "But Amanda, those conditions asked me to deny who I am, who we were together." "I know," she said, a tear slipping down her cheek. "When I read your letter, it was like suddenly seeing the past 15 years clearly for the first time. How I've let Richard reshape my memories, my history. How I've let him push you to the margins of my life. He offered you things I couldn't," I said, working to keep any bitterness from my voice. "A lifestyle, connections, opportunities. But you offered me things he never could," Amanda countered, surprising me. "Unconditional love, stability. A father who showed up not because it looked good or served his ego, but because he genuinely cared." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of misunderstandings and missed connections between us. "What changed?" I finally asked. "After all this time, what made you see things differently?" "James, partly," Amanda admitted. "He asked me questions about my childhood that I realized I'd been answering with Richard's version of events for so long that I'd almost forgotten the truth." She paused, then added, "And your letter, the photos and cards you sent, they reminded me of who I was before I started measuring everything by Richard's standards." More silence, but less strained now. "I don't expect things to be fixed in one conversation," I said. "There's been too much distance for too long, but I want you to know that I meant what I wrote. My love for you has never been conditional." Amanda set down her tea and looked me directly in the eyes. "I want you at my wedding, Dad. Not on Richard's terms, but as my father, my real father." "What does that mean practically?" I asked, needing to be clear. "It means I'd like you to walk me down the aisle," she said. "Alongside Richard," she added quickly, seeing my expression. "I know that's not ideal, but it's a start. A public acknowledgement of your place in my life." I considered this. Not a complete restoration, but a beginning. "And the other conditions, the speech restrictions, the limitations on what I can talk about, forget them," Amanda said firmly. "Be yourself. Talk about our memories. I want James's family to know who I really am, where I really come from. And I want to remember too. It wasn't everything, but it was something. A crack in the wall that had grown between us. I can accept that, I said. Thank you for coming today. As she was preparing to leave, Amanda hesitated at the door. Dad. The locket you sent. I'm wearing it for the wedding. As my something old. She reached inside her blouse and pulled it out, showing me that she was wearing it even now. To remind me of where I came from. Who I really am. I felt a lump form in my throat. It looks beautiful on you, was all I could manage to say. She hugged me, then really hugged me for the first time in years. I'll see you at the wedding, she said. All of you, not just the parts that fit Richard's narrative. After she left, I sat in my living room for a long time, feeling like I could finally take a full breath after years of shallow breathing. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There were still hurts to heal, trusts to rebuild. But it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are enough. The wedding day arrived clear and bright. The vineyard estate was every bit as lavish as I had expected, with panoramic views and tasteful decorations that undoubtedly cost more than my annual income. As I entered the venue, I was conscious of eyes on me, particularly from Sophia's family members who hadn't seen me in years. Richard was in full host mode, greeting guests with practiced charm, his hand constantly on Sophia's back, in a gesture of possession. When he saw me, his smile faltered slightly before recovering. He extended his hand mechanically. Marion, he said, his voice neutral. Amanda mentioned there had been some changes to the arrangements. Yes, I replied simply, shaking his hand firmly. She and I had a good talk. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. The important thing is that this day goes smoothly for Amanda. On that we can agree, I said, moving past him to find my seat. The ceremony itself was beautiful. When the moment came, I stood waiting at the back of the aisle. Amanda appeared in her wedding dress, looking radiant. Richard was already at her side, but she held out her other arm for me. As we walked her down the aisle together, I could feel Richard's stiffness beside me, but I focused only on my daughter, on the trust she was placing in me by having me there. At the reception, Richard gave his speech first. It was polished and witty, full of anecdotes about Amanda's accomplishments in college and her career. He spoke about how proud he was of the woman she had become, how he had always known she was destined for greatness. When it was my turn, I kept it simple and heartfelt. I spoke about Amanda's compassion, evident from when she was a small child. I told the story of how she had once used her entire allowance to buy food for a homeless man we saw on the street, about how she had always stood up for kids being bullied at school, about how her moral compass had always pointed true. Success can be measured in many ways, I concluded. In wealth, in status, in accomplishments. But the truest measure of success, I believe, is in how we treat others. By that measure, Amanda has always been the most successful person I know. James, you are a fortunate man to have won the heart of someone so genuinely good. And Amanda, I could not be prouder of the woman you have always been. As I returned to my seat, I caught Amanda's eye. She was crying but smiling through her tears. James reached over and squeezed her hand, then nodded to me with respect and understanding. Later during the father-daughter dance, Amanda whispered, "Thank you for coming, for being here as yourself." "I wouldn't have it any other way," I told her. "This is a beginning for us, Amanda. A new chapter." "I'd like that," she said, resting her head briefly on my shoulder as we danced. The rest of the wedding passed in a blur of toasts, dancing, and conversations with guests who seemed genuinely interested in hearing about Amanda's early years. Richard remained cold and aloof toward me, but I didn't care. This wasn't about him anymore. In the weeks and months that followed, Amanda and I began the slow work of rebuilding our relationship. She and James came for dinner at my condo. I introduced them to Sandra. We started a tradition of monthly family dinners, sometimes including Richard and Sophia, sometimes just the four of us. It wasn't always easy. Years of distance had created patterns that were hard to break. There were misunderstandings, moments of tension, old hurts that resurfaced unexpectedly. But we were both committed to creating something new and healthier than what we had before. 6 months after the wedding, Amanda called me on a random Tuesday, not for any reason, just to chat. As we talked about everyday things, work and weather and books we'd read, I realized that this simple connection was what I had missed most. Not the big moments like walking her down the aisle, but the small moments of ordinary sharing that make up a real relationship. Looking back now, I can see that standing up for myself was the kindest thing I could have done, not just for me, but for Amanda too. By refusing to be less than I was, by insisting on the truth of our shared history, I had given her back a part of herself that she had been encouraged to deny. The lesson was profound and unexpected. True love requires respect both for the other person and for oneself. Sometimes the strongest act of love is setting a boundary. Sometimes healing can only begin when we have the courage to speak our truth, even when that truth is difficult to hear. Amanda and Richard still have a relationship, but it has changed. She sees him more clearly now, both his generosity and his manipulations. She's learning to accept what he can give without allowing him to define her. As for me, I have a fuller life than I could have imagined 2 years ago. Sandra and I were married in a small ceremony last spring, with Amanda as my best woman. I have deepened old friendships and made new ones. I volunteer regularly, finding purpose in teaching young people the skills I spent a lifetime developing. Most importantly, I have my daughter back. Not as the adoring child she once was, nor as the distant adult she became, but as a woman who sees me clearly and values me for who I am. A woman who is reclaiming her own history and identity piece by piece. If you find yourself in a relationship where you're asked to be less than you are, where your truth is inconvenient or unwelcome, I encourage you to find the courage to stand up for yourself. Not with anger or bitterness, but with love and a deep commitment to what's real. The path of authenticity isn't always easy, but it's the only one that leads to genuine connection. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone you love? How did it change your relationship? Share your story in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to hear more stories of healing and growth. Remember, sometimes the most profound act of love is having the courage to be fully yourself. Thank you for listening. And until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.